Thank you all. As Patricia said, we are going to discuss some work that we have been doing in the last few years to measure proxies for competition using mainly firm level data. So let me get to this and confirm what my fellow panelists have said before, that there is no perfect measure of competition and that we should actually use different measures to try to gauge some reliable trends. What we have done is to focus on different measures of static competition, in particular concentration and markups, but also to look more at the dynamic aspect and in particular mergers and acquisition, but also these measures of churn that were mentioned by my colleagues, entry and exit rates in particular. Now, as has been said, each of these different measures has big limitations in really capturing a market, and I'm thinking especially of concentration, but also to measure really product market competition. Now, the good news for us is by using different measures, we can see that the trends all seem to go in the same direction. And in particular, Steve was mentioning the work of Thomas Philippon. They all go in the direction of increase in concentration, which might not be all bad, but might be good if we think that this is actually related to the increase in intangible assets and is related also to the digital transformation. That said, this may not mean that it's good forever, because in a dynamic sense, these efficient firms and more productive firms can actually entrench themselves, and that might become more of a problem if we look at it in a dynamic sense, and if we look also at the entrance. Now, as I said, one of the questions was, is this a coincidence? And I've already given you my view of this and my interpretation of these different trends. We don't think so, and we show that actually these are related to structural change, and as I said, in particular, increase in the use and the role of knowledge-based assets and the digital transformation. So let me go quickly to the results. The first trend that we looked at was concentration. Even within the different measures, we conduct a lot of robustness check and look at different details, if you want. And I think here in this type of analysis, the devil is really in the detail, and let me get to this. So the first measure that we use relies on representative data that we obtain using a distributed microdata approach from the different statistical offices. We have about 20 countries. And we look at the share, or how the share of industry sales generated by the 10% largest firms has evolved over time. And I would like to stress my limitation here. We are looking at country two-digit industry, not as a market. So we have to make the assumption that this is a market. This is a very, very, very strong assumption, and really, like as you heard before, it's not a good one, but that's in a way we are measuring industry concentration, not market concentration. The second source of data is commercial data, firm level data, across 26 countries, and we do different robustness checks here. We use different country industry as sort of our reference, our, let's call it market in guillemets, as the French say, sort of, or we use entire regions, in particular all of Europe as a market at the geographical level, because in a way in manufacturing, especially in Europe, this might be quite credible. What we do, and this is where I talk about the devil is in the detail, we spend a lot of time trying to allocate the different sales to different groups, take into account the ownership linkages across countries and therefore the structure of multinational group. The second thing that we do, we look at the role of the denominator, and in particular, when you measure concentration, when you measure Herfindahl index and similar things, it's really important to have a measure of sales in the market, in this case, for me, the industry. And to do so, we need to have some data that covers the entire sector. And therefore, we need to rely on STAN, which is an industry level database that we hold at the OECD. The challenges were already mentioned. We have an industry, we don't have a market. We suffer in many respects from the points that Steve was making on import, and export. We try to correct for that in our econometric analysis. And then, we need to make some decisions, and we need to test the robustness to using country, region, or even, when possible, local level, which we don't generally have. The results show that there has been an increase in concentration using the different measures. This is also in line from work that Tommaso Duso recently and co-authors recently published, but also that the European Commission and Tommaso Valletti and these co-authors showed in Europe. One thing that we show, if you believe that there is an element of bad concentration in some of these, we see that the US has grown, the concentration in the US has grown much more strongly. And this is something that might be sort of in line with the hypothesis of Philip Pond that sort of claims that, in the US there has been much more of an issue with antitrust. The devil is in the detail. You see it here very much the importance of using the right denominator. If we don't use a denominator that represents the whole population of businesses, you don't see this increase in concentration. And this is something that previous literature had done. And we sort of raised this point, which I think is an important one. Second measure, markups. I think probably most of you know this measure and know the criticism, so I'll go very quickly. We use the methodology adopted by DeLocker and Barsinski. And the biggest challenge here is that, we have a ratio, and in the numerator, we have the estimated elasticity, and therefore you need to make a lot of assumption to estimate the consistent elasticity. And in the denominator, we have the cost of intermediates, which we define as the share of the firm revenue. Now, the idea, the rationale is really that in perfect competition, input shares are equal to output elasticities. Now, the criticism here are really about the fact that you need to assume that firms are cost minimizing. You need to assume that the inputs that you use in your estimation is fully flexible, and you have a choice between intermediates and labor. We believe that intermediates, especially in a cross-country setting, is much better. And you need to make assumption on the specification of the production function. The biggest criticism of all, however, is my point 2 here, which is the mismeasurement that of markup due to the importance of overhead costs, and therefore what you're really capturing is not a rise in market power, but a rise in overhead costs and rising importance of fixed cost, possibly related to the presence of intangible assets. Now, what do we find? Again, lots of robustness. I'm not going to go into the detail. Again, it goes in the same direction. If we believe that markup measure, like an increase in markup measures a worsening of the competitive environment, that's exactly what you see here. And in particular, when I look across the whole distribution of firms, we find that the biggest increase in markup is really happening at the top of the distribution. So again, this seemed to be in line with the result that we shown on concentration. Third measure that we mentioned was mergers acquisition. We have looked at that, and we see that both in values and numbers of deals, this has increased significantly over the same time period, for which I've shown the trends in concentration and markups. And then when I want to continue and look at this dynamic aspect of concentration, we look at entry rates across the whole economy, together with job reallocation rates and exit rate. Now, entry rate is actually a measure of this creative distraction process. And what we find is that this has been declining quite steadily across different sectors and different countries. And for the US, and John mentioned this has been happening for a much longer time period. For some countries, we can look back to 1995. Now,
we have 10 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So COVID has actually worsened some of these trends. And, if you look at this, at the role of intangibles and digital transformation, you actually see that very much the trends that I've shown you are very much related to the importance of intangible assets. When I showed you here, digital intensity, and you see this also in the dynamic aspect of competition. So we see that the declining in entry rates has been stronger in more digital intensive sectors. So thank you very much.